I'll just give people the rundown on our little excitement here, why we're here tonight instead of at the bookstore. Valdas Anelauskas is here. We, a bunch of us went down to Eugene a while ago to see the Pacifica Forum. And at the Pacifica Forum, Valdas was there, totally butchering the name, and we met him, and he was great, and he has been a great scholar, and it was obvious that he had some pretty sharp things to say about the current situation, and Jay alerted us that he had come up with this lecture on the Frankfurt School, and that sounded like groovy. So let's do it. We invited him to come, and suddenly, suddenly we started catching all sorts of flack, originating on probably with a guy named who probably is an agent. What was his name? No, I don't know.
His first name's Petrus.
Yeah. Anyway, he put something up on, and the next thing we know, we're getting all sorts of pressure at the bookstore, including some people who are collective members within the bookstore, to shut the event down. We kind of maneuvered to move it over to the. This is the darkest element. Was that only a handful of people knew that we had moved it over to the, and. Before noon today, they had already found that out and put pressure on the to cancel it there. So that's why we re-maneuvered to here. The dark element there is that it feels like, well, unless there's an out-and-out spy or phones have been tapped. It's one of the two things. What else is new? Yeah. So fortunately, is here, and so here we are. I mean, it could have been worse, I suppose. We had talked about meeting in a park. And, for people who aren't too familiar with the Frankfurt School, I know I assume you'll be introducing the school to some extent. Yeah, okay.
Biggest.
We're all kind of familiar with the fact that the old paradigm of communism, left-wing socialism versus capitalism
is bullshit.
Yeah, is bullshit, and it's kind of collapsing. Has been collapsing, and has pretty much completely collapsed at this point in time, and which has put the left that exists in the United States in this very odd, precarious position of backing things like the conspiracy theory that the Arabs attacked the United States on 9/11 and stuff like that. So, here we are, and it kind of goes back to these theorists, Marx, who, was a Mason or maybe was a Mason. So, the agenda of the New World Order appears to be more what's at work here than a dialectic between some sort of socialist, capitalist thing going on. So I'm not going to go on. I'm anxious to hear what Valdas has to say, and we'll take a break when the food comes back in.
Okay. So since we are in this rather unusual environment here, and food will be, so let's keep it more informal than I initially intended. And I had no idea about that bookstore. I thought it's something like Powell's Books, and then when I received this news yesterday about the lecture being canceled, so I did some research, and what I found out that that was probably not such a good idea from the beginning to even try that bookstore. It's some anarchist, leftist, and so of course they have good connections with Eugene, and it doesn't take much to find out who I am in Eugene. They run articles in our Register Guard almost each week about Pacifica Forum or about me, and and it's all over the internet. So, well, I know that you are 9/11 Truth group. Well, I don't know what it means, 9/11 Truth. I don't like that word, truth, because there is not such thing as absolute truth, but there are many lies. So I would rather call 9/11 lies group truth. Well, I don't know much myself about 9/11, so as we said on that page, well, I'm probably not exactly speaker that would enlighten you about 9/11. The only thing I know about what is that I used to go to World Trade Center when I lived in New York to use toilet there, and when we tried to blow it in first time in '93, so that truck of explosives was parked right under that toilet that I enjoyed so much. By that time I already moved to New Jersey and I just watched on TV, but well, if they did that earlier so I could be sitting there. So that's the only connection I have to World Trade Center and 9/11. When 9/11 happened, I happened to be climbing South Sister on that day. So I just found out when I came home from wilderness. But anyways, as I said, what I will be talking today, it's more about deeper lies that lay behind all that lie about, let's say, 9/11. I just want to tie somehow to 9/11 because they said that I have no qualification to talk about 9/11. And when I was giving the same lecture in Eugene at University of Oregon, so I was asked for how many years I lived in Eugene, and I said 15. And then when they were introducing me, I was thinking, and that was May 22nd. And it just came to my head that exactly 20 years ago, on 22nd of May, I was kicked out of the Soviet Union. So that was some very symbolic coincidence that on the same day I was giving this lecture first time. And so I can say that being there, seeing that, and exactly 20 years ago, on 22nd of May of 1989, I left what was called Soviet Union at that time. And on the next day, on the 23rd of May, when I stepped out of train in Vienna and made my first steps in what was called and what I believed to be free world, I thought that I left it all behind. But now, when Obamaniacs in this country try to introduce these hate speech crime laws and some little KGBs bookstore try to enforce those things even before laws are introduced. So I see that what I left behind 20 years ago probably will catch me here someday, just as it did with people like David Irving, Ernst Zundel, Germar Rudolph, and many, many others. So it can be said, Marx is dead, long live Marx. And now I should give credits to people that this whole lecture that I prepared is based on. because when I did that, I decided not to use my own research, because if I use my own research, it turns into something like it did with my series of lectures that made me so notorious in Eugene and Oregon and nationwide here about Zionism and Russia that I gave at University of Oregon 3 years ago. So I used mainly my own research and my own experiences in the Soviet Union, and it took 8 lectures, almost 2 hours each, so it's like 16 hours to complete. Well, I don't have so much time, so I used more condensed materials, and these all things were taken from mostly writings of, first of all, of William Lind, who's a historian and director of the Center for Cultural Conservatism of the Free Congress Foundation in Washington, D.C. And I wish you could also someday watch his excellent video. It's called The History of Political Correctness. Also, I took some materials from writings of Raymond Rin, who is a member of Council for National Policy and also founder of U.S. Global Strategy Council. Also from Dr. Gerald L. Atkinson from U.S. Navy Academy, and very much from books of Pat Buchanan, who is one of my favorite writers and who needs no introduction. But it's all available all over the internet, and of course, to anyone who is interested in finding out more, especially about Jewish aspect of all these things that I don't emphasize so much as maybe I should, but I just don't want to make those people happy. So this is a book by Kevin MacDonald, who is professor of psychology at the University of California at Long Beach. It's called The Culture of Critique, an evolutionary analysis of Jewish involvement in 20th century intellectual and political movement. And this is must read. This is something like textbook. It's available probably at Powell's Books, or can be ordered through internet. And it's a very important book. Well, those who attended my lectures at the university in Eugene know that I like to use a lot of quotations from various books and original sources. But this lecture I want to start with something different, with quotations, but not from some scholarly academic books, but from movies. And first one is from 1969 movie Easy Rider, where a character played by Jack Nicholson said, "This used to be a hell of a good country. I can't understand what's gone wrong with it." And another is from movie The Wizard of Oz from 1939, where Dorothy said to her little dog, "Toto, I don't think we are in Kansas anymore." And when I came to this country 20 years ago, well, I thought it's really free world, and it was so different from where I came, where I was born, where I lived, and for 30 years, almost 30 years. And then I talked to people who were much older than I am, and especially I had one friend who was a Russian immigrant who came after the revolution, and he was pretty old at that time. And I remember we walked once in New York in Times Square, and that was a really terrible place in the early 90s, before Mayor Giuliani cleaned a little bit up. I heard it's better now. And he told me that we used to go with children there just to walk and have fun, and all those attractions on Sundays. And I couldn't believe how we could go there. Prostitutes, drugs, and all things, Times Square. It's terrible. So I couldn't understand that. And I just remember that we lived in the Soviet Union, we heard all those stories that Americans don't lock doors of their houses and all those things. It's really something I can't believe. But now, when I did some research, so it's true that like just 50 years ago, and let's say in the 50s, that probably not many of you can really remember, America was still a great place to live. It was safe. People's homes were safe to the point where many people really did not bother to lock their doors. It was decent society. Where did it all go? How did that America become sleazy, decadent, dangerous place that we live in today? So different that those people who grew up and lived prior to the 60s feel like it is a foreign country. That we are not in that hell of a good Kansas anymore. Did it just happen? And when I asked this question, rhetorical question at UO, some people said, but wow, what you are talking about? Before 60s, that was hell, not good country. That was racism all over and injustices and all kinds of things. And well, and I answered with a short quote from Pat Buchanan's book called The Death of the West, where he said, what is one man's septic tank is another's hot tub. Well, and I don't mind if somebody is swimming in septic tank. The only thing that I don't want that man to take me and drag to swim with him together in that thing. Because I prefer, well, I would definitely prefer America of the 50s to America of today. But unfortunately, as I said, not many of you, and even who were born here, well, lived in. So not many people living today know how it was. So, speaking about America, when General Cornwallis' army surrendered and marched out of Yorktown, the band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." And today, now, our world has been turned upside down. What was right and true yesterday is wrong and false today. What was immoral and shameful has become progressive and praiseworthy today. Nietzsche called it the transvaluation of all values, when the old virtues become sins and the old sins become virtues. And the situation is even worse in Europe, where people have begun to feel like strangers in their own land. Their countries are rapidly turning into, as Pat Buchanan says, and I quote him again from his book, The Death of the West. He says, turning into cultural wasteland and a moral sewer that are not worth living in and not worth fighting for. And here I want also to quote from some unusual source from email that I received from my friend who lives in Denmark just about a month ago, after I wrote to her about my lecture that I gave at University of Oregon back in March about changing Europe, about what's happening to Europe. And what she wrote to me, and I quote directly from her email, she said, "You are right, Valdas, that Europe and Denmark are changing very much. I am no longer proud of being Danish and no longer think that Danish kingdom is the best country in the world." And when I read this, I just remembered what 11 years ago I was a guest at her house, and she is older lady, retired school teacher in her 70s. And we used to sit and have nice dinners and talk, and she always called Denmark butterhole. And I thought, what it means, butterhole? And then she explained to me that that is something that she has from her childhood as memory of something very good, because they used to have like mashed potatoes and made some hole and put some melted butter there. And when we were kids, So that was the best thing after the war. There wasn't much food probably. That was butterhole. So she considered that her country is like butterhole, something so good, so good. And now this is what she said. And here I have another excerpt from email that I received from another friend, and maybe it's not that important to read here because, well, in Eugene I read after my lecture about changing Europe, and I was talking there about this immigration, this totally uncontrolled immigration now from Muslim countries and even from Africa to Europe, that is totally changing cities, like big cities like London and Paris and those who follow the situation there. So now that what was happening like just 3 years ago when Paris was literally burning, when there were all those riots by... So this is a long quotation, I better skip it. And to make us love our country ought to be lovely, said Edmund Burke, the British statesman and philosopher. In too many ways, Europe and America are no longer lovely today. In just a half of a century, what was denounced as the counterculture has become now the dominant culture, and what was the dominant culture has become now a dissident culture. In half a lifetime, people have seen their culture polluted, their values assaulted, their countries invaded, and themselves demonized as extremists and bigots for holding on to beliefs that our ancestors have held for many, many generations. For the first time in history, Americans now start to be fearful of what they say, of what they write, and even of what they think. They have to be afraid of using the wrong word, a word denounced as offensive or insensitive or racist, sexist or homophobic. And I'm not even talking about Europeans. Today, Europe is rapidly turning into something that reminds Russia under Stalin or, well, Orwellian Oceania of 1984. Well, you have seen other countries where this has been the case. Russia, China, North Korea, for example, and you have always regarded them with a mixture of pity probably and probably some amusement, because it has struck you as so strange that other people in those other countries would allow a situation to develop where they would be afraid of what words they used. But Americans now have the situation in this country themselves. It is not only on college campuses, it is spreading throughout the whole society now. Why did it happen? Where does it come from? What is it? Well, as William Lind says, it didn't just happen. In fact, a deliberate agenda was followed to steal, to destroy traditional culture and leave a new and very different one in its place. The story of how and why is one of the most important parts of this nation's history, and it is a story almost no one knows. Well, the people behind it wanted it that way. What happened, in short, is that America's traditional culture, as well as Europe's culture, which had developed and grown up over generations, was swept aside by an ideology, very hostile ideology. Over the last 50 or so years, America has been conquered basically by the same force that earlier in the 20th century took over Russia. And that force, yes, it has also pretty much same ideology. That ideology has inflicted enormous damage on the traditional culture it came to dominate, fracturing it everywhere and sweeping much of it away. In its place came fear and ruin. It happened in Russia, it is happening here now. The ideology that has taken over America is, yes, it is Marxism. Same old Marxism, same communist ideology. But it goes today here most commonly by some new cryptic name, liberalism. And here I want to kind of make, again, comment that this word liberalism is just as distorted in American English language as word football is distorted. In whole world, word football means one game. In this country, for some reason, it means different, and there was invented new word soccer for football. Same thing is about liberalism. If you say word liberal in many European countries, it means something little to the right from what Republicans are in this country. And here, for some reason, it means leftist, basically leftist, communist. Also, this is known as something called political correctness. And many people, I know, tend still to think of this political correctness thing as only half serious or even as a joke. But it's not. In fact, it's a deadly serious thing. Because political correctness was a phrase originally used in Communist Party intellectual circles in the 1930s and 1940s. It was the great disease of 20th century, the disease that has left tens of millions of people dead in Russia, in China, indeed around the world. It is the disease of this Marxist ideology, and this political correctness is what reminds me of cultural revolution in Maoist China. When if you say something, we put this hat that reminded Inquisition hats that in Middle Ages in Spain we used to put, and they just walk you on the street because of what you said or what you thought. So this PC thing, as people say, it's not personal computer. It's not funny. This PC is deadly serious thing. Believe me, I've been there and I saw that thing. Because it is still alive and well here and now. This diabolically crafted idea of political correctness is a Machiavellian psychological command and control device. Its purpose is the imposition of uniformity in thought, speech, and behavior. It seeks to alter virtually all the rules, formal and informal, that govern relations among people and institutions. It wants to change behavior, thought, even the words you use. To a significant extent, it already has. Wherever or whatever controls language also controls thought. If we look at it analytically, if we look at it historically, we quickly found out exactly what it is. As I just said, today's so-called liberalism here, with its political correctness, really is nothing but cultural Marxism. It is Marxism translated from economic into cultural terms. And it is an effort that goes back not to the 1960s, but back to World War I and Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Incredible as it may seem, just as the old-fashioned Marxism of the Soviet Union has faded away, a new cultural Marxism, or as it is sometimes called Western Marxism or even humanist Marxism, has becoming the ruling ideology in both America and Europe. The number one goal of that cultural Marxism today, and as it was since its creation, has been the destruction of Western culture and Western civilization. If we compare the basic tenets of today's so-called liberalism and its political correctness with classical Marxism, the parallels are very obvious. First of all, both are totalitarian ideologies. The totalitarian nature of political correctness is revealed nowhere more clearly today than on American college campuses, many of which at this point are already becoming like small ivy-covered North Koreas, where the student or faculty member who dares to cross any of the lines set up by the, let's say, feminist or homosexual rights activist or some black or Hispanic or Jewish or Muslim group or any of the other sainted victim groups of PC revolves around, quickly find themselves in trouble. And we at the University of Oregon's in Pacifica Forum know that very well. That is a little look in the future that political correctness intends for the nation as a whole. Indeed, all ideologies are totalitarian because the essence of an ideology is to take some philosophy and say on the basis of this philosophy certain things must be true, such as, for example, that the whole of the history of Western civilization is the history of the oppression of Jews. You know, Holocaust and stuff like that. Since reality contradicts that, reality must be forbidden. It must become forbidden to acknowledge the reality of our history. People must be forced to live a lie, and since people are naturally reluctant to live a lie, they naturally use their ears and eyes to look out and say, wait a minute, this isn't true. I can see it isn't true. The power of the state, then, must be put behind the demand to live a lie. That is why ideology invariably creates a totalitarian state. So yes, the parallels are very evident between the classical Marxism that we are familiar with and lived under it in the old Soviet Union and the cultural Marxism that I see reincarnated today as so-called liberalism and political correctness here in America and also in Europe. But the parallels are not accidents. The parallels did not come from nothing. The fact of the matter is that political correctness has a history that is much longer than most people except maybe a small group of academics who have studied this are aware of. To understand anything, we have to know its history. To understand who stole your culture and are destroying your civilization, you need to take a look at the history of political correctness or cultural Marxism. This is what we are going to do today. Indeed, a thoughtful person should ask himself or herself or whether or not all this change from America's traditional culture is simply a random set of events played out by a random set of players, all independent of each other, all disconnected from any central premise or guidance. It is entirely possible that chance is at work here, and all of these threads of American culture are the random workings of the human intellect, the pursuit of what is possible, what is appropriate in a free and democratic society. Now, but suppose you were to learn that all of the changes are completely consistent with a design, that is a concept, a way of thinking, and a process of bringing it about. And suppose one could identify a core group of people who designed just such a concept and taught through the process of infusing it into our culture. Wouldn't you be interested in at least learning about such a core group? Wouldn't you want to know who they were, what they taught, and how they conjured up a process for bringing their thoughts into action? For anyone with even a smidgen of curiosity, the answer should be a resounding yes. If such a core group could be found, then it would still depend on your personal worldview as to its significance. If you believe in the blind watchmaker, that is all cosmic and social events are random and guided only by the laws of nature, evolutionary in the sense of competing with other random events for survival in a stochastic world, you may choose to believe that such a core group was meaningless. It may have existed, but so what? It may have been only one of an uncountably large number of such groups in the world's history. And you may believe that any particular group's window of opportunity to influence future generations was passed by and did little to influence the course of our history. Well, if you believe instead that nature has a design and that all events can be connected and we humans can make sense out of many of them if we will only connect all the dots, then you may believe that this small core group has great influence even today in what's happening to our culture and society and our civilization. If this is your worldview, you may, but not necessarily, even believe in a conspiracy and conspirators, who aim to alter our world on a vast scale. It is clear, however, that irrespective of one's worldview, it is informative to at least know of such a core group, if it indeed existed, what it believed, what it set out to accomplish, and what methods it followed to take action on its beliefs. Yes, such a core group did indeed exist. And yes, As President Franklin Roosevelt once said, I quote, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If something happens, you can be sure that it was planned that way." Early, original Marxist theory said that if Europe ever erupted in war, the working class in every European country would rise in revolt, overthrow their governments, and create a new communist Europe, because the workers had more in common with each other across the national boundaries than they had in common with the ruling class in their own country. Well, when First World War broke out in the summer of 1914, that didn't happen. Throughout Europe, workers rallied to their flag and lined up by the millions to fight their country's enemies. The Kaiser shook hands with even the leaders of the Marxist Social Democratic Party in Germany and said, "There are no parties now, there are only Germans." And this happened in every country in Europe. So something was wrong. Marxists knew by definition it couldn't be the theory. Theory was right. Well, in 1917, they finally got a Marxist coup in Russia, and it looked like the theory was finally working. But then it stalled again. In the days following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, it was believed that revolutions would sweep into Europe and eventually into the United States. But it did not do so. When attempts were made to spread revolution immediately after the war, with the Spartacist uprising in Berlin, with the Belakon government in Hungary, with the Munich Soviet, the workers didn't support them at all. So Marxist theorists had to ask themselves the question, what went wrong? No, as good Marxists, they could not admit that Marxist theory had been incorrect. So the Marxists had a problem. And two of their leading theorists went to work on it. Antonio Gramsci from Italy and George Lukács from Hungary. His real name was actually George Bernard Levinger. Gramsci said that the workers will never see their true class interests as defined by Marxism until they are freed from Western culture. That they are blinded by culture to their true class interests. That the communist revolution was impossible in the West until culture could be destroyed. The new battleground, reasoned Gramsci, must become the culture, starting with the traditional family and completely engulfing schools, media, entertainment, civic organizations, literature, science, history, and so on. All of these things must be radically transformed and the social and cultural order gradually turned upside down. George Lukács, whose book History and Class Consciousness had brought him recognition as the most brilliant Marxist theorist to rival Marx himself, also theorized, just like Gramsci, that the greatest obstacle to the creation of a communist paradise was the culture, Western civilization itself. He famously asked in 1919, "Who will save us from Western civilization?" "I saw the revolutionary destruction of society as the one and only solution," said Lukács. "A worldwide overturning of values cannot take place without the annihilation of the old values and the creation of new ones by the revolutionaries." End of quote. That objective, established as cultural Marxism's goal right at the beginning, has never changed. Gramsci famously laid out a whole strategy for destroying Western culture, one that has proven all too successful by now. Rather than seize power first as in Russia and then impose a cultural revolution from above, Gramsci argued that Marxists in the West must first change the culture. Then power would fall into their laps like ripened fruit. But to change the culture would require a long march through the institutions. The arts, media, schools, colleges, every institution that could influence the culture. He realized that in order to achieve a socialist victory, cultural institutions would have to be infiltrated and subverted. One by one, Each had to be captured and converted and politicized into an agency of revolution. Then the people could be slowly educated to understand and even welcome the revolution itself. That long march through the institutions, as Gramsci called it, is what America has experienced, especially since the 1960s. On the cover of his 1970 runaway bestseller called The Greening of America, which was the manifesto of the counterculture, its author, Charles Reich, parroted Gramsci perfectly. And I quote from that book, page 2. "There is a revolution coming. It will not be like revolutions of the past. It will originate with the individual and with culture, and it will change the political structure only as its final act. It will not require violence to succeed, and it cannot be successfully resisted with violence. It is now spreading with amazing rapidity, and already our laws, institutions, and social structure are changing in consequence. This is the revolution of the new generation." End of quote. This is from a book written by Charles Reich and called The Greening of America, and published in 1971, page 2. Well, in Italy, Mussolini recognized the danger Gramsci posed and jailed him. Languishing in prison, near death from tuberculosis, Gramsci was finally freed, but died in 1937 at 46. And his influence remained rather small until the 1960s, when his works, especially the prison notebooks, were rediscovered. In his prison notebooks, Gramsci left the blueprints for a successful Marxist revolution in the West. So now, finally today, he is receiving deserved recognition as the greatest Marxist strategist of the 20th century. Gramsci's idea of how to make a revolution in a Western society has been proven correct. Communist regime in Russia shook the world for 70 years, but ultimately that revolution failed because Soviet regime collapsed. But the Gramscian revolution rolls on, and to this day it continues to make converts in America and into Europe. While Gramsci expired without seeing any success of his ideas, George Lukács was a bit luckier. As Deputy Commissar for Culture in Bela Kun's regime in Hungary, Lukács even got a chance to put his self-described demonic ideas into action in what came to be known as cultural terrorism. As part of this terrorism, he launched, for example, a radical sex education program in schools. Lukács realized that if he could destroy the country's traditional morals, he would have taken a giant step toward destroying its traditional culture. Lukács's purpose in promoting free sex, even among children, was to destroy the family, the core institution of Western culture. 5 decades later, his ideas would be enthusiastically embraced by baby boomers and the sexual revolution that swept America and Europe. But back in 1918, far from rallying to Lukács's cultural terrorism, the Hungarian working class was so outraged by it that when Romania invaded Hungary, the workers would not fight for the Bela Kun government, and it failed immediately. Then Lukács disappeared, but not for long. Towards the end of 1922, the Communist International, it was called Comintern, began to consider what the reasons of all those failures were. On Lenin's initiative, a meeting took place at the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. Amongst those present, of course, was George Lukács. And also there was Willy Münzenberg, whose proposed solution was, and I quote from him, to organize the intellectuals and use them to make Western civilization stink. Only then, after we have corrupted all its values and made life impossible, can we impose the dictatorship of the proletariat. End of quote. It was, as said Ralph de Toledano, the conservative author and co-founder of the National Review, a meeting perhaps more harmful to Western civilization than the Bolshevik Revolution itself. Then, in 1923, Lukács turned up at a Marxist study week in Germany, a program sponsored by a young Marxist named Felix Weil, who had inherited millions from his father and had lots of money to spend. He was disturbed by failures and by the divisions among the Marxists at that time, so he sponsored something called the First Marxist Work Week, where he brought Lukács and many of the key Marxist thinkers together for a week working on the problems of Marxism. Felix Weil and the others who attended that study week were fascinated by Lukács's cultural perspective on Marxism. And the Weil decided, what we need is a think tank. Today, Washington, D.C., as we know, is full of think tanks, and we think of them as very modern. In fact, you see, they go back quite a ways. So Weil used some of his money to set up a new think tank in Frankfurt, Germany. In 1923, he endowed an institute associated with Frankfurt University. Originally, it was to be called the Institute for Marxism, modeled on the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. But after some reflection, the people behind it decided that it was not to their advantage to be openly identified as Marxist. They realized they could be far more effective if they concealed their real nature and objectives. So they convinced Weil to give the new institute a less provocative, neutral-sounding name, Institute for Social Research. Felix Weil was very clear about his goals. In 1971, he wrote to Martin Jay, the author of a principal book on the Frankfurt School, The Dialectic Imagination, and he said, I quote, "I wanted the institute to become known, perhaps famous, due to its contributions to Marxism." Well, as author of another principal book about the Frankfurt School, Ralph Wegerhaus said, I quote, "Felix Weil, a son of a millionaire, founded an institute for Marxism, hoping one day to hand it over to a victorious German Soviet state." End of quote. The first director of the institute from 1923 till 1929, Karl Grünberg, was himself an avowed Marxist, although the institute did not have any official party affiliations. Grünberg concluded his opening address, according to Martin Jay, and I quote again from that book, by clearly stating his personal allegiance to Marxism as a scientific methodology. Marxism, he said, would be the ruling principle at the institute, and that never changed. Soon, known simply as the Frankfurt School, the institute took on the role of translating Marxism from economic into cultural terms to create, yes, so-called political correctness as we know it today. So, the basic answer to the question, who stole our culture, is the cultural Marxists of the Frankfurt School. In the death of the West, the Frankfurt School must be held as a prime suspect and principal accomplice, says Pat Buchanan in his book, The Death of the West. The destructive nature of the Frankfurt School is obvious from even a cursory examination of its primary text, and I did read most of them, and it's really, really heavy reading. The initial work at the Institute was still rather conventional. They worked mainly on conventional Marxist issues such as the labor movement and others. But in 1930, that changed dramatically. That year, a renegade Marxist, Max Horkheimer, an admirer of Marquis de Sade, became Institute's director. Yes, he was very much a Marxist dissident, who, just like Gramsci and Lukács, had concluded that Marx had gotten it wrong. The working class was not up to its role as the vanguard of the revolution. Horkheimer, of course, had been strongly influenced by George Lukács. He immediately set to work to turn the Frankfurt School into the place where Lukács's pioneering work on cultural Marxism could be developed further into a full-blown ideology. The old battlefield manuals were thrown out and new manuals had to be written. To old Marxists, the enemy was capitalism. To new Marxists, the enemy was Western culture and civilization. To that end, Horkheimer brought some new members into the Frankfurt School. Perhaps the most important was Theodor Adorno, whose real name was Wiesengrund, who would become Horkheimer's most creative collaborator. Other members included two psychologists, Erich Fromm and Wilhelm Reich, and a young graduate student named Herbert Marcuse. There were also, to name just a few most important, Walter Benjamin, Friedrich Pollack, Leo Löwenthal, Otto Kirchheimer, Franz Neyman, Karl Wittfogel, and some others. They all worked hard and made three major advances in the development of cultural Marxism. First, they broke with Marx's view that culture was merely part of society's superstructure, which was determined by economic factors. Horkheimer said that, on the contrary, culture was an independent and very important factor in shaping a society. Second, again contrary to Marx, Horkheimer announced that in the future the working class would not be the agent of revolution. He left open the question of who would play that role, a question Marcuse answered in the 1960s. Third, Horkheimer and the other Frankfurt School brains decided that the key to destroying Western culture was to cross Marx with Freud. They argued that just as workers were oppressed under capitalism, so under Western culture and civilization, everyone supposedly lived in a constant state of psychological repression. Liberating everyone from that repression became one of cultural Marxism's main goals. Even more important, they realized that psychology offered them a far more powerful tool than philosophy for destroying Western culture: the technique of psychological conditioning. The Frankfurt School introduced the idea of psychological conditioning as a means of changing the culture to fit their image. So the key to making the translation of Marxism from economic into cultural terms was essentially, yes, combining it with Freudism. So it also can be called not just cultural Marxism, but Freudian Marxism. Again, Martin Jay writes in his books on Frankfurt School, and I quote, "If it can be said that in the early years of its history, the Institute concerned itself primarily with the analysis of bourgeois society's socio-economic substructure," and I point here out that Martin Jay is very sympathetic to the Frankfurt School. I'm not reading here from critic. And he continues, "In the years after 1930, its primary interests lay in its cultural superstructure. Indeed, the traditional Marxist formula regarding the relationship between the two was brought into question by critical theory." End of quote. So here it comes. To serve the purpose of negating Western culture, the Frankfurt School developed a powerful tool it called critical theory, which is shorthand for critical theory of society. Critical theory was essentially destructive criticism of the main elements of Western culture: authority, family, patriarchy, hierarchy, morality, tradition, sexual restraint, loyalty, patriotism, nationalism, heredity, ethnocentrism, convention, and conservatism, you name it. The stuff that we hear all the time today, the radical feminism, gay pride, environmentalism, multiculturalism, diversity, the women's studies, the gay studies, the black studies, the Chicano studies, and so on, all these things are basically branches of critical theory. As I said, what the Frankfurt School essentially did to create this theory called critical theory is draw on both on Marx and on Freud. Now the term is ingenious because you are tempted to ask, what is the theory? Well, the theory is to criticize by subjecting every traditional institution, starting with family, to endless, brutal, unremitting criticism. The cultural Marxists hope to bring them down. By the way, the Frankfurt School was careful never to define what it was for, only what it was against. The theory is that the way to bring down Western culture and civilization is not to lay down an alternative. They explicitly refuse to do that. They say it can't be done, that we can't even imagine what a free society would look like, their definition of a free society, as long as we are still living under repression, the repression of a Western civilization which creates, in their theory, the Freudian condition, the conditions that Freud describes in individuals of repression. We can't even imagine it, free society. What critical theory is about is simply criticizing. It calls for the most destructive criticism possible, in every possible way, designed to bring the current order down. Critical theory eventually induces cultural pessimism, a sense of alienation, of hopelessness, of despair, where even thought prosperous and free, people come to see its society and country as oppressive, as evil, and unworthy of its loyalty and love. The new Marxists considered cultural pessimism a necessary precondition of revolutionary change. And of course, when we hear, for example, from the Jews today that the whole of society is just out to oppress them and so on, that kind of criticism is also a derivative of critical theory. It is all coming from the same Frankfurt School. By substituting racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and a host of other isms for the traditional Marxist bogey of capitalism, critical theory ensured that Marxism would thrive long after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Both political correctness and critical theory today are in essence nothing but psychological bullying. Political correctness is cultural Marxism, a regime to punish this dissent and to stigmatize social heresy as the Inquisition punished religious heresy. Its trademark is intolerance, says again Pat Buchanan in his book The Death of the West. The key creators of critical theory, besides Horkheimer, as I just said, were Theodor Adorno and, most importantly, Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse. These two introduced an element which is central to their theory, and that's the sexual element. And particularly Marcuse, who in his own later writings calls for a society of polymorphous perversity. That is his definition of the future of the world that they wanted to create, polymorphous perversity. But how all of this stuff got in here, into America? How it got into our universities and media, indeed, into our lives today? The Frankfurt School was well on the way to creating their critical theory and the political correctness in Germany. Then suddenly, fate rudely intruded. In 1933, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party came to power in Germany. Since the Frankfurt School was Marxist, and the Nazis, of course, hated Marxism, and since all school's members were Jewish, they were not a good fit for the Third Reich. The Nazis, not surprisingly, shut down the Institute for Social Research. Then, the maestros of critical theory and negative dialectic packed their ideology and fled to America to continue their effort to save us from Western civilization. While they fled not to Moscow, to New York. With the assistance of Columbia University, they set up their new Frankfurt School in New York City and redirected their talents and energies to undermining the culture of the country that had given them refuge. Taking advantage of American hospitality, the Frankfurt School immediately resumed its intellectual work to create cultural Marxism here in the United States. Though many of them remained writing only in German, still they shifted their focus from critical theory about German society, destructive criticism about every aspect of that society, to critical theory directed toward American society. So their focus shifted from destroying traditional Western culture in Germany to doing so in the United States. It would prove all too successful. To their earlier achievements in Germany, those Frankfurters soon added quite a few new developments here in America. Additional intellectual firepower was required. A theory to pathologize what was to be destroyed. Their project began with the book that bore the title Studies of Authority and Family and was published in 1936. The book was premised on the notion that the traditional family creates a character prone to racism and fascism. Thus, anyone who upholds traditional moral values is both racist and fascist. Children raised by traditional values, parents, we are told to believe, will almost certainly become racist and fascist. By extension, if fascism and racism are endemic to traditional culture, then everyone raised in the old-fashioned conservative traditions is in need of psychological help. It was Marx who wrote so despairingly about the idea of the family being the basic unit of society. Anyone who is familiar with Karl Marx's demonic theory of destruction, his war plan of 1843, which revealed his process for the disintegration of the family as the basic unit of society, as he wrote in his book The German Ideology of 1845, will find it easy to accept the reality that critical theory of the Frankfurt School is but a mere transmutation of these ideas. For cultural Marxists, no cause ranked higher than the abolition of the family, which were despised as a dictatorship and the incubator of sexism and social injustice. To William Reich, and I quote him, "The authoritarian family is the authoritarian state in miniature. Familial imperialism is reproduced in national imperialism." End of quote. To Adorno, the patriarchal family was the cradle of fascism. Well, this was one of the basic tenets of the critical theory, the necessity of breaking down the traditional family. The Frankfurt School scholars preached that, and I quote, "Even a partial breakdown of parental authority in the family might tend to increase the readiness of a coming generation to accept social change." End of quote. Then, sponsored by, surprise, surprise, the American Jewish Committee and the B'nai B'rith, they started a major project under general name Studies in Prejudice. The Frankfurt School sought to define traditional attitudes on every issue as prejudice in a series of academic studies which included titles like, for example, Anti-Semitism and Emotional Disorder. It culminated in an immensely influential book called The Authoritarian Personality, written by Theodor Adorno and his colleagues and published in 1950. Pat Buchanan calls this book the altarpiece of the Frankfurt School. It substantially influenced American psychologists and social scientists. Charles Sykes, senior fellow at the Wisconsin Policy Research Center, describes the authoritarian personality as, and I quote him, "an uncompromising indictment of bourgeois civilization with the twist that what was considered merely old-fashioned by previous critics was now declared both fascistic and psychologically warped." End of quote. So now the Frankfurt School augmented cultural Marxism with Adorno's idea of the authoritarian personality. It developed the concept of the authoritarian personality to get scholarly justification for its irrationalism, defining as authoritarian anyone who has too high a regard for family, nation, or reason itself. For that purpose, we invented some bogus so-called F-scale that purported to tie traditional beliefs on, for example, sexual morals, relations between man and woman, and questions touching on the family to support for fascism. Today, the favorite term for the so-called liberals, those of politically correct sort, used for anyone who disagrees with them is fascist or Nazi. Well, fascist or Nazi, this is what describe me. It's easy. These, by the way, are following a script that ran parallel to the party line laid down by the Moscow Central Committee in 1943, and I quote from that: "Members and front organizations must continually embarrass, discredit, and degrade our critics. when obstructionists become too irritating, label them as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic. The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind. End of quote. Words are weapons, said George Orwell. By calling an enemy a racist or fascist, you no longer need answer his arguments. Conspicuous throughout the authoritarian personality is the association of totalitarianism and authoritarianism with fascism, but not with communism. Indeed, the book actually even suggests a connection between anti-communism and totalitarianism, equates communists with members of persecuted outgroups, and states that hostility toward the communists may be a displaced form of anti-Semitism. So, the Frankfurt School devised the authoritarian personality profile as a weapon to be used against political enemies. To Adorno and his comrades, all people who refused to conform to the new morality were viewed as mentally ill and in need of treatment. The book's purpose was to make every group affiliation sound as if it were a sign of mental disorder. Everything from patriotism to religion to family and race, loyalty are signs of a dangerous and defective authoritarian personality. From the beginning, this was social science with a political agenda. Christopher Lask writes, and I quote, from his book called The True and Only Heaven, Progress and Its Critics, published in 1991. He says, by identifying the liberal personality as the antithesis of the authoritarian personality, they equated mental health with an approved political position. They defended liberalism on the grounds that other positions had their roots in personal pathology. End of quote. The pernicious influence of Adorno's authoritarian personality idea can be clearly seen in some of the much more recent stuff. For example, in August of 2003, the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Science Foundation announced the results of their $1.2 million taxpayer-funded study, which stated essentially that conservatives, traditionalists, are mentally disturbed. Researchers from the Universities of Maryland, California, and Berkeley and Stanford had determined that social conservatives, and I quote from that study, social conservatives suffer from mental rigidity, dogmatism, and uncertainty avoidance, together with associated indicators for mental illness. End of quote. This Orwellian cast of the pathologies named here shows how far Gramsci's long march has led us. Since the 1960s, branding opponents as haters, Nazis, fascists, or simply mentally sick has been the most effective weapon of the arsenal of the left. Here is the secret formula as described by psychologist and author Thomas Seize, and I quote from his book, A Nation of Victims, published in 1992. He says, if you want to debase what a person is doing, call him mentally ill. End of quote. The legacy of the authoritarian personality was to give an air of scientific respectability to smearing any arguments that with terms denoting mental sickness, for example, xenophobe, racist, and homophobe. Conservatism was not a political outlook to be debated, but a psychiatric condition to be treated. Assessing Frankfurt School's studies in prejudice, of which the authoritarian personality was the best known, Christopher Lask wrote, and I quote again from his book called The True and Only Heaven. He says, the purpose and design of studies in prejudice dictated the conclusion that prejudice, a psychological disorder rooted in the authoritarian personality structure, could be eradicated only by subjecting American people to what amounted to collective psychotherapy, by treating them as inmates of an insane asylum. End of quote. Another of the insights of Horkheimer and Adorno was to realize that the road to cultural hegemony was through psychological conditioning, not philosophical argument. America's children could be conditioned at school to reject their parents' social and moral beliefs as racist, sexist, and homophobic, and conditioned to embrace a new morality. They openly stated that whether children learned facts or skills at school was less important than that they graduate conditioned to display the correct attitudes. Well, ancient philosopher Plato said in his famous Laws, and I quote, "So long as the young generation is and continues to be well brought up, our ship of state will have a fair voyage. Otherwise, the consequences are better left unspoken." End of quote. This is from Plato, Laws. And this is from so-called poet Allen Ginsberg. What he said, "We will get you through your children," boasted Allen Ginsberg. And this is what they did. Today, public schools today are what columnist Joseph Sobran calls liberalism's reproductive system. Or as another columnist, Ann Coulter, said, left's madrasas. Nowhere is the overthrow of the moral order more evident than in how Frankfurt School departed from orthodox Marxism, which argued that all of history was determined by who owned the means of production. Instead, they said history was determined by which groups defined as man, woman, races, religions, etc., had power or dominance over other groups. Certain groups, especially white males, of course, were labeled oppressors, while other groups were defined as victims. Victims were automatically good, oppressors bad, just as by what group they came from, regardless of individual behavior of some person. As Richard Bernstein made clear in his book on multiculturalism, called The Dictatorship of Virtue, Multiculturalism and the Battle for America's Future, published in 1994, and I quote from his book, "The Marxist revolutionary process for the past several decades in America has centered on race and sex warfare rather than class warfare, as in earlier times." End of quote. This quiet revolution resulted in a mass conversion of Americans and Europeans by dialectic stages of operant conditioning by words such as prejudice, discrimination, bigotry, racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism that were designed to instill guilt, pity, shame, fear, anger, and hatred in the Americans so that no one would dare oppose the social revolution without being exposed to uncontrollable rage, intimidation, and terror. This being a reflection of Karl Marx's dictum that the nation must be taught to be terrified of itself. There was another very important transition when the war came. Some of them went to work for the government, including Herbert Marcuse, who became a key figure in the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA. And some of them, including Horkheimer and Adorno, moved to Hollywood. Led by Adorno, the Frankfurt School initially opposed the culture industry, which they thought commodified culture. Then we started to listen to Walter Benjamin, a close friend of both Horkheimer and Adorno, who argued that cultural Marxism could make powerful use of tools like radio, film, and later television to psychologically condition the public. Benjamin's view prevailed, and Horkheimer and Adorno spent the World War II years in Hollywood. According to Martin Jay, writing in his book The Dialectical Imagination, I quote from him, "Perhaps the most effective of these tools were to be found in the cultural field. American mass culture thus became one of the central concerns of the Frankfurt School in the 1940s." End of quote. It is no accident that the entertainment industry is now cultural Marxism's most powerful weapon. After World War II and the defeat of the Nazis, Horkheimer, Adorno, and some other members of the Frankfurt School returned to Germany, where the institute re-established itself in Frankfurt with the help of the American occupation authorities. And cultural Marxism in time became the unofficial but all-pervasive ideology in the Federal Republic of Germany. But, well, hell had not forgotten the United States. Herbert Marcuse remained here, and he set about translating the very difficult and highly abstract academic writings of other members of the Frankfurt School into simpler terms Americans could easily grasp. He repackaged everything in ways college students could read and understand. His book, for example, Eros and Civilization, used the Frankfurt School's crossing of Marx with Freud to argue that if we would only liberate ourselves through, again, polymorphous perversity, we could create a new paradise. Eros and Civilization became one of the scripture to the New Left in the 1960s. Eros and Civilization basically gave Marx a fitting makeover for the new era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Past societies had been subverted mainly by words and books, but Marcuse believed that sex and drugs were superior weapons. In Eros and Civilization, Marcuse urged a universal embrace of the pleasure principle. Reject the cultural order entirely, said Marcuse. This was his great refusal, what he called, a rejection of all basic Western concepts, and we can create a world of polymorphous perversity, which we have today. Marcuse also widened the Frankfurt School's theoretical work. In the early 1930s, Horkheimer had left open the question of who would replace the proletarians as the agent of Marxist revolution. In the 1950s, Marcuse answered the question, saying it would be a coalition of, minorities, feminists, and homosexuals, all the sacred victim groups of political correctness today. As for racial conflict, Marcuse wrote that white people are always guilty, and that blacks are the most natural force of rebellion. Marcuse further took one of political correctness' favorite words, tolerance, and gave it a new meaning. He defined something he called liberating tolerance as tolerance for all ideas and movements coming from the left and intolerance for all ideas and movements coming from the right. When the left speaks of tolerance, this is what we mean. When you hear the cultural Marxists today call for tolerance, we mean Marcuse's liberating tolerance. Just as when they call for diversity, we mean uniformity of belief in their ideology. Marcuse's screed repressive tolerance went even further, calling for, and I quote from that book, withdrawal of tolerance from regressive movements before we can become active, intolerance even toward thought, opinion, and word, and finally intolerance toward the self-styled conservatives to the political right. End of quote. So, the witch hunt in today's society is merely the implementation of Marcuse's concept of repressive toleration enforced by the followers, devotees of the Frankfurt School. Marcuse may be the most important member of the Frankfurt School in terms of the origins of what we see today, because he was the critical link to the so-called counterculture of the 60s. He was the Pied Piper of the 60s, guru of the New Left. His objective was clear, and I quote from him. One can rightfully speak of a cultural revolution since the protest is directed toward the whole cultural establishment, including morality of existing society. End of quote. The youth rebellion of the 60s, driven largely by opposition to the draft for the Vietnam War, gave Marcuse a historic opportunity. As its most famous guru, he injected the Frankfurt School's cultural Marxism into a baby boom generation in America and in Europe. He actually became a cult figure. When students revolted in Paris in 1968, they carried banners proclaiming Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. Of course, many did not and still don't understand what it really was. As was true from the beginning, Marcuse and a few other people in the know did not advertise that this so-called liberalism of today and political correctness and multiculturalism were a form of Marxism. But the effect was devastating. A whole generation of Americans and Europeans, especially the educated elite, absorbed cultural Marxism as their own, accepting a poisonous ideology that sought to destroy traditional culture. That generation, which runs nearly every institution in America today, especially universities, now wages a ceaseless war on all traditional beliefs and institutions. They have largely won that war. Most of our traditional culture lays in ruins. And here I want to mention one of followers of Frankfurt School that I have some kind of personal memories about. And so when I was in elementary school, about like 10, 11, 12 years old, there was everywhere in newspapers, in magazines, this black woman with curly big hair, and we remember Angela Davis was, and to such extent that even kids, we had this girl in our class with curly hair, so we called her Angela Davis. And then, well, I just forgot about Angela Davis, and when I already lived in Eugene, I see posters one day, Angela Davis will be speaking at Holt Center, which is a big concert hall in Eugene. So I was so curious because I remember she was just darling of Soviet communists and KGB. And so I went there, the hall was packed. And then she came to university. Again, I went to listen to her while I'm open-minded. Nobody was protesting there. She was just like hero. And who that Angela Davis was? She was leading American black radical and Communist Party member who was described at Frankfurt School member Herbert Marcuse as my best student. She also studied in Frankfurt under Adorno, and then she went on the run after purchasing the guns used for a failed raid on a Marin County, California courthouse that resulted in several deaths, including the decapitation of a judge. Judge Harold Halley's head was blown off by a sawed-off shotgun owned by Angela Davis. She supplied the hijackers with a small arsenal, but claimed not to know the purpose for which it was used. Davis was on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. In 1972, 18 months after her capture, she was tried and acquitted. The fact that she owned one of the guns used in the crime was not sufficient to establish her responsibility for the plot. She was acquitted by a jury that makes that from the O.J. Simpson case appear reasonable and unbiased. Following the verdict, one juror faced news cameras and gave a revolutionary clenched fist salute. He laughed at the justice system, saying that prosecutors had been mistaken to expect that the middle-class jury would convict Davis. He and most of the jurors then went off to partake in a Davis victory party. Following her release, Davis temporarily relocated to Cuba. In 1979, Davis was awarded the International Lenin Peace Prize, formerly named the International Stalin Peace Prize. She was famously denounced by Alexander Solzhenitsyn for her cruel hypocrisy regarding the political prisoners of communist regimes. Then Davis ran for vice president on the communist ticket in 1980 and 1984. Davis's efforts were rewarded with tenure at University of California at Santa Cruz, where she is currently the presidential chair and professor with the History of Consciousness Department and director of the Feminist Studies Department. In 1997, she came out as a lesbian. So, well, when I was giving this lecture at university in Eugene, well, I said, nobody was protesting when this person came to speak there, and that's good. Why she should be protested? But when David Irving came, or Mark Weber came, or Tom Sunich came, there were protesters outside screaming. So this is a good example.
We have to learn.
Yes, so we finish. Our enemies, those, as we like to call themselves, social engineers, do not balk today, loudly and proudly voicing their intentions. They know and admit with satanic certainty what we are doing. Well, I will give you examples of followers of Frankfurt School, and this will be a good ending. Take, for example, Susan Sontag, who declared that, I quote, "The white race is the cancer of human history." No, she was never condemned for such a hateful, racist statement. She was instead always lauded by the media and positively received by academia. Rewrite that sentence, for example, with Jewish race in place of white race, and the passage would, well, you know what I mean. Had Sontag so savaged her fellow Jews, her career would have ended right there. But her diatribe against the white race did not diminish her standing at all. Sontag subsequently won a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, and one recent survey found her the most respected intellectual of all time. Moreover, many Americans and Europeans have come to accept Sontag's indictment of their civilization and have volunteered pro bono to assist the prosecution in making its case. Then there was another social philosopher in France, Jacques Derrida, famous for his bizarre theories on what he called deconstructionism. He sought to deconstruct, that is, destroy, basically, and I quote from him, "the workings of strong nation states with powerful immigration policies, the rhetoric of nationalism, the politics of place, the metaphysics of native land and native tongue." Here, deconstruct is simply a politically correct euphemism for destroy. Now, a certain Noel Ignatieff, who is a tenured professor at Harvard University, proclaims that, I quote, "treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity." At the least, Professor Ignatieff intends cultural and psychological terror against all whites. It is still unclear whether physical extermination is also part of the program. He actually did say that he and others such as they call themselves new abolitionists will not limit themselves to socially acceptable means of action, and that they do not reject any means of attaining their goal. Professor Ignatieff does not believe his agenda is controversial at all. According to Ignatieff, I quote, "the key to solving the social problems of our age is to abolish the white race." He even argues that abolishing the white race is so desirable that some may find it hard to believe that anyone other than committed white supremacists would oppose it. Thus, he put white people on notice. If they oppose their abolition, then they are white supremacists. All these statements may seem just crazy to the casual reader or listener, but to anyone who has been paying attention to this spirit of what's going on, all that I said, and even these little things that happened with this bookstore and what we did after it happened right here in this restaurant is open defiance to political correctness. These words should be written on everywhere. And here I will quote from Pat Buchanan, what he says in his book, The Death of the West. And he says, "The right response to the intolerant new orthodoxy is defiance, ridicule, and counterattack. Political adversaries who use terms like Nazi, fascist, anti-Semite, homophobe, bigot, xenophobe, and extremist have started a fight and should be accommodated. Courage is contagious, and defiance can lead to a recovery of will." Thank you.
All right.